Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the organizers for their invitation. The collaboration between the office and my mandate has always been very fruitful. A major pull factor for migration is the need for migrant labor in destination states. Many people see migration as the only way to improve their social and economic situation, and they sometimes see no other option but to migrate irregularly due to a lack of regular migration channels, particularly for low-wage workers. Migrants, and particularly irregular migrants or migrants with a precarious administrative status, such as temporary migrant workers, are often willing to do the dirty, difficult and dangerous jobs that nationals will not, at the exploitative wages that unscrupulous employers will offer. Migrants are sometimes accused, including in the public debate, of stealing jobs by accepting lower wages and poor working conditions. However, migrants would not come if there were no jobs available. Yet states seem to invest very few resources in trying to reduce the informal sector and sanction employers who take advantage of the precariousness in which migrants find themselves and exploit migrants to illegally reduce their labor costs and boost their competitiveness. Migrants are at a heightened risk of exploitation and abuse in the workplace due to a number of factors, including deceptive recruitment practices both by employers and intermediaries, frequent lack of social support systems, unfamiliarity with the local culture, language, their rights at work, or national labor and migration laws, limited or denied access to legal and administrative systems, dependence on the job and on the employer due to migration-related debt, such as illegal but prevalent recruitment fees, but also dependence due to legal status or the employers restricting their freedom to leave the workplace, and also reliance by family members on remittances sent back home by the migrants. These factors are amplified by the discrimination and xenophobia that migrants are increasingly facing everywhere. A key contributing factor of this exploitation is their general fear of being identified, arrested, detained, deported, or if they have a temporary status, their fear of being branded a troublemaker and not rehired. Consequently, they are generally reluctant to risk complaining, protesting, organizing, or publicly mobilizing, preferring most often to discreetly move on. In my 2014 Human Rights Council report on labor exploitation, I provide a collection of some of the worst practices migrants face in different regions of the world, irrespective of their migration status. This includes discrimination by their employers on many grounds, such as nationality, race, and sex, with regard to, inter alia, remuneration, excessive overtime, opportunities for promotion, access to health care, and unfair dismissals. Frequent human rights violations experienced by migrants in relation to payment of wages include non-payment or excessive delays in the payment of wages, or receiving unfair wages, including unequal pay for the same work or work of equal value, based on discriminatory criteria such as nationality. Irregular migrants are frequently victims of labor exploitation. Due to their very precarious situation, they often feel forced to accept working for lower wages than regular migrants or nationals, and in much worse conditions. Additionally, they regularly have difficult access to social services and healthcare and live in constant fear of being detected, detained, and deported. Migrant domestic workers, the majority of whom are women and girls, are extremely vulnerable to violence and abuse. In its General Comment Number 1 of 2011 on migrant domestic workers, the Committee on Migrant Workers identified practices that increase the risk of abuse and exploitation in the workplace for migrant domestic workers, including, and I quote, dependence on the job and employer because of migration-related debt, legal status, practices of employers restricting their freedom to leave the workplace, the simple fact that the migrant's workplace may also be their only shelter." End of quote. These risks and vulnerabilities are further aggravated for migrant domestic workers who are in an irregular situation, as they often risk deportation if they contact state authorities to seek protection from an abusive employer. I have met with domestic workers who had run away from their employers after severe physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. They also reported poor working and living conditions, including excessive working hours, sometimes without meal or rest breaks, no weekly days off, not being given sufficient food, not being paid for several months, and having their passports confiscated. They also suffer threats and intimidation, including that their employer will not renew their visa, have them deported, make false allegations to the police about them stealing from the household or being thrown out into the streets. I recall one case in which a migrant domestic worker who was repeatedly physically and sexually abused by her employer ran away, ended up in a detention center, and later on, while in a psychiatric hospital, committed suicide. Migrant domestic workers who are women are particularly at risk of gender-based violence. I've met with several women domestic workers who are victims of sexual harassment and abuse. Those who become pregnant as a result of rape seek to have unsafe abortions or abandon their babies in order to avoid being stigmatized upon their return to their home countries, where they may already have a husband and children. Migrant domestic workers, especially live-in workers, are particularly vulnerable to abuse as their workplaces are in private households, behind closed doors, and out of the public eye. They are thus physically isolated, which makes it difficult for them to take collective action. They are frequently unregistered and form part of the informal labor market. The frequent abuse against migrant domestic workers is further aggregated by the lack of labor inspections in private households, in law or in practice. The right to change employer is instrumental in facilitating the escape of migrant domestic workers from exploitative and abusive situations. It is important for abused domestic workers to receive support and assistance and be able to file a complaint against their employer and seek work with another employer without facing the risk of being deported. A good practice that was brought to my attention concerns a visa system in which visas are granted to the individual domestic workers and entitle them to basic labor rights under national employment legislation, including the right to pursue legal remedies against their employers. This has enabled migrant domestic workers to escape abuse and exploitation, in part because the visas are not tied to one employer. Consequently, domestic migrant workers who wish to leave their employer due to abuse, exploitation, and other forms of ill treatment are not treated as irregular migrants facing the risk of arrest and imprisonment, but rather as victims. Due to lack of knowledge of the local language and legislation, migrants too frequently do not have access to an effective remedy. In many countries, domestic workers are not recognized as workers and thus not protected by labor law. As a consequence, they have no labor rights, no annual leave, no established working hours, no minimum salary. And health and safety regulations may not apply to private households. Furthermore, migrants who report abuse by their employer may fear retaliation. Complaint mechanisms and courts are often not easily accessible for migrants, especially due to the frequent lack of interpreters and legal aid. Access to justice is an illusion for many migrants, and certainly most irregular migrants. The rule of law is simply not benefiting migrants. The right to organize and engage in collective bargaining is essential for migrants to express their needs and defend their rights, in particular through trade unions and labor organizations. However, some countries reserve the right to form and join associations and trade unions for their own nationals, and in some countries, irregular migrants are prohibited from joining trade unions. Migrants often experience that their work contract does not make the terms and conditions for termination of the employment relationship clear. They can thus be denied the freedom to terminate employment and find another employer. Migrants, particularly those in an irregular situation, are also often victims of unfair dismissal. Labour inspections are thus an important tool to combat human rights violations committed against migrants in the workplace and can, if undertaken properly, prevent such violations from occurring. However, the criminalization of irregular entry and stay and the emphasis on immigration control has in some countries led to cooperation between labour inspection and immigration enforcement and imposition of immigration control duties on labour inspectors. The result impedes effective protection of all migrants under labour law and also intimidates migrants from denouncing abusive working conditions and from cooperating with labour authorities. Fighting labour exploitation of migrants by sanctioning exploitative employers would reduce the attractiveness of irregular employment for employers and thus considerably decrease the size of the underground labour markets that are a key pull factor in irregular migration. More crucially, states should recognize their country's real labour needs and establish open, safe and regular channels for low-wage workers, including migrant domestic workers. Implementing firewalls between immigration enforcement and public services generally, such as healthcare, schools, labour inspectors, social workers, local police, and others, would also greatly contribute to empowering migrants to denounce abuse and fight for their rights, through reducing the fear of being detected, detained, and deported while interacting with public authorities. Empowering individuals to act, individually or collectively, in favor of the respect and protection of their own rights is what has always worked best in the history of the human rights movement. Migrants, who by definition will never have access to the political stage to advance their agenda, need access to all empowerment tools available to be able to have their voices heard, voices that aren't heard enough yet. I thank you for your kind attention.